If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button as well as the bell to be notified of future videos. Thank you.
Hello Internet, we are back. We've got Colonel Brian Adams here with us. He told me in a previous episode he's not actually related to the singer. I have to make this joke, of course, I'm sure you heard it many times, but that betrays my age as well. On a personal front, it's hot, it's damn hot here in Switzerland, it's part of a heat wave. When we're recording this, I'm sweating a bit, don't worry about that, I'm not dying or anything. It's just warm, it's really, really warm. Now, I'm really grateful that you came back to talk to us, and the Colonel tells me he's going to have probably another episode besides this one, where it's going to be a little bit more on a lighter note, you know, the jokes, the army life. You're more than welcome, sir. Let me say that to you. You're more than welcome. Thank you for your time. Thank you for coming to us today. Let us carry on with your story then, with your career, and by all accounts, it was a remarkable career. Over to you.
Thanks, Chris. And once again, I'd just like to say thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for your initiative. Thank you for the privilege of being here, because I really believe that, you know, when I was a youngster, we didn't have this kind of thing available to us. We had to read books. And I wish that I'd had the opportunity to listen to some other old soldiers, to hear their experiences. And I hope that in some small way, what I'm going to say and what I have said is going to impact on their career choices down the road. Because it's not, being a soldier is not a political thing. It's a human being thing. There always have been soldiers and there always will be soldiers. And my family, going back 1,000 years, have been soldiers. And I'm very proud of that. And I'm very proud of the time that I spent in the army, even though it was only 22 years. And then I had a break and I had a second life and a second career. But let me pick up where I ended off last time, and that was at the end of 1991, when we had ended the pre-course for staff course, which is the South African Army Command and Staff course, which is the course of a soldier's career in the army. It kind of positions you for your future. And I was absolutely privileged to be part of that in 1992. And we were 80 of us that started in 1991, started the pre-course. And then it was disrupted because we all had to run off and go to Operation Protea, which none of us really felt sorry about, because we all had a brilliant time. And then we, after a couple of days, leave, in my case in Cape Town. And in my case, when I tried to go home the first time, it snowed at Jan Smuts Airport. So I had to stay over another day with my friend Sean Nordier, who I think you're going to have on your program, or you've had on your program. And then I spent a couple of days, and we came back and finished the course off. And of the 80 that started, there were 21 that eventually got on the course, 21 South Africans. And after a year, after 46 weeks at the end of 1982, 1982, there were 18 that completed the course. So it was a hell of a course, if I can be so bold as to say. It sorted out, it sifted, it prepared, it energized, it prepared us for our futures. And looking back, it was something that I will always be proud of and always be grateful for. I tried to find out what the NQF qualification is, and unfortunately, nobody in South Africa has ever worked out a national qualification framework grade. But according to one of my friends that was eventually the military attaché in America, the similar course in the States qualifies as NQF 8, which is a master's degree. So that gives you some idea of what we were looking at here. And I can tell you, I really don't know what it cost the army to put us through this year, because not only our salaries, not only our accommodation and all those costs, not only the instructors, but we traveled the length and breadth of Southern Africa. We there was nothing that was spared. We had instructors and lecturers from universities, from Arms Corps, from, you can imagine, the Department of Foreign Affairs. We had the best of the best talking to us about strategy and about all these kind of things. So it was an absolutely mind-blowing experience. The fact that the course took place at the Army College in Voortrekkerhoogte, at the old building, which where the cornerstone was laid by Kitchener of Khartoum, and that didn't go down with everybody very well, but it was a remarkable Victorian building, beautiful sandstone building. And we had all our meals in the officers' mess. We had all our lectures there, but we each lived in our own rondavel. We each had our own little rondavel, a thatched rondavel, and each rondavel was allocated to a specific corps. So you had the armor rondavels, you had the infantry rondavels, the artillery, etc., etc. And for some reason, I was allocated to rondavel number 3, which was the Special Forces rondavel. And I was never in Special Forces. Although I heard later that it was the intention of the powers that be that I would be sent to Special Forces headquarters as a staff officer after the staff course, but that was changed through circumstances. But anyway, I was in rondavel number 3, and each of the little rondavels was properly furnished and taken care of by the specific corps that looked over that rondavel. And each of us had two or three of us shared a batman. And so we everything was taken care of. We had super meals. We were really looked after, and it was a delightful experience. As I mentioned, it was very challenging, especially the first couple of months when they were really trying to sort out the men from the boys and to do the sifting. And we worked many nights. We worked through until the birds chirped. We used to call it chirping. And I'll never forget one morning, my little daughter, Lauren, her mom, my wife, decided that she wasn't seeing enough of her dad. So on the way to, my wife was a lecturer at UNISA at the time, and on the way to taking her to work and dropping off at the nursery school, she decided to drop her off and let her come and say hello to me in my rondavel. And when she came in, I was on my knees on the floor, coloring in one of my maps for a presentation that we had to do. And apparently, she got to her school that morning, and she very proudly told her teacher, you know, that my dad loves coloring in as well. And I thought that was pretty cool, because she obviously didn't understand what I was busy doing. But there I was with my knees on the carpet with this huge map, coloring all the things that I needed to color in. But we traveled around the country a lot. And as I mentioned, no cost seemed to be spared. We had a couple of aircraft that seemed to be allocated to us, and we traveled to all the corps schools. We traveled to just about every corner of South Africa, and that was actually improved upon, because halfway through the course, the course morphed into the Senior Joint Warfare course, and we had a whole lot of Air Force and Navy guys that joined us. And then we also traveled to Simonstown, and we went on submarines. We traveled to a whole lot of Air Force bases, and we saw firsthand what was actually going on the ground. So that was absolutely brilliant. In lighter vein, as always, one of the guys on the course, he always used to brag about the fact that he never packed his little suitcase, that his wife, he always used to just drop it at home, and his wife would unpack the suitcase and everything would be sorted out. And every time he needed to go, his wife would pack the suitcase. So one of the guys decided to put some condoms in his suitcase. And when he came back from one of the outings, he just dropped his bag, and his wife dutifully picked up the bag and started unpacking it. And needless to say, there was a little bit of sparks and a little bit of drama in that household for a couple of weeks. And I think I won't mention his name, but I think he's still trying to find out who the guys were that dropped him so deep in the brown stuff. The other thing which I remember, and some of the other lighter note stories I'll certainly talk about if I do have the opportunity to do a third session. But one of the other issues was the snoring. And luckily it seems to have abated a bit, but I've always been a very, very bad snorer. And with the result that Eddie Fulyun, my old friend whose birthday it is today, he also snored very badly. And with the result that Eddie and I were always roommates, because everybody said, no, Adams, you and Fulyun, you there together, and all the other guys will mix and move around, but we were always together virtually for the whole year, Fulyun and I. We also had some other great arrangements on our course. Because we all lived in our own individual rondavels, there was a challenge in keeping our soda and our ice cold. And one of my mates, Brian Regan, his rondavel was probably about 10 meters away from my rondavel. And I had whiskey and soda, and he had ice because he had a little bar fridge in his rondavel. And although we weren't allowed to communicate with each other or talk to each other, what I would do is I'd shout out to Brian, come out, and I would pour 2 scotches and leave 2 scotch glasses on the crazy paving pathway, and he would come out with soda, top them up, fill them up with ice, shout to me, and then I'd go and get my glass and whatever. So that became a bit of a standard joke amongst all the other guys, that these 2 Brians were making a plan to have their ice cold scotch and soda every evening. And we had an arrangement on the staff course that every month we would have a session which they called teerdrink, drinking tea, a tea drinking session with the instructors. And each of us would go in one on our own, and we would get feedback from the instructors about how we were doing. And it was actually quite a serious thing. A lot of us were dreading what we were going to hear, because it was, as I said, this is a milestone. It's a tipping point in a person's career. And one was always kind of a little bit worried about how you were doing and what kind of feedback you were going to get. I'll never forget on one occasion, I was called in probably about the middle of the year, and there were these 2 or 3 instructors sitting there very, very seriously looking at me. And the one said, you're doing okay, you're doing fine, you're meeting all the milestones, but we're just a little bit worried that you seem to be not doing your own work. Jeez, I can tell you, the hair stood up on the back of the neck. I was so angry, because that's one thing they could never hold against me. So I said, what do you mean? And they said, no, we understand that you're getting help from a guy called Johnny Walker. Johnny. And I said, well, fine. And then we all burst out laughing. And then I realized that if that's all the instructors had to say to me, then I wasn't in any difficulty whatsoever. The other thing which was absolutely amazing about our course was that we all had little jobs to do on the course. And Brian Regan and he was the chairman and I was the vice chairman of the social committee. And as the social committee, we had a couple of jobs to do. We had to organize all the social events and the braais and all those things that happened. But the other thing we had was we had a wooden box which we painted PWD grey, that's Public Works Department grey. That's all the buildings in the public works set up of this sort of battleship grey sort of color. And we had this box, which is about 600 millimeters long by 300 or 450 wide and a little about that deep. And it was called Dr. Axel's medicine box. And our job was to make a mix of the most outrageous combination of anything we could find. And then when we would leave on our bus, we had a big serving spoon, and one of us would hold the spoon and the other would pour, and everybody had to have a medicine measure of Dr. Axel's special brew. And that became from the first week of the course until the end, we had this dreadful cough mixture that we used to dispense at the door of the bus or whatever we were going away in. The other thing which was our responsibility was at our volleyball court, we had a larpa, a thatched larpa where we would hang out when we had some spare time, which wasn't all that often. But in the larpa, we had a fridge. And in that fridge, we had a whole bar, no spirits, but it was beers and cokes and all kinds of other stuff. And, I met up with Brian Regan again at our reunion a couple of weeks ago. And I confirmed with him that after 11 months of running that thing, we had 2 shortages in the whole year. we had an honor bar. It was an honor bar where everybody would just write down what they took. And after 11 months, we had the only shortages we had were 2 small Cokes that were not accounted for in a whole year. And I think that's an amazing feat. And I think it's a credit to all of us that attended, that we were so honest and so honorable that we were completely clear about how we want to run this whole thing, which was absolutely brilliant. Our meals in the officers' mess were brilliant, and we had the best chefs that you could possibly imagine. We had this magnificent dining room where we used to sit and eat, and I suppose that's one of the consolation prizes that we had, because we really worked our backsides off. But the one consolation was that breakfast was always out of this world, eggs to order. You could order what you wanted. Lunches, dinners were first class, and hats off to the chef. They were absolutely first class. The other amazing thing about that course was that apart from all the pressure and everything, there were a whole lot of traditions that happened throughout the course. And one of them was called Blommetjies Aand. The Night of the Blossoms, perhaps, is a good translation, although it doesn't really do justice to it. But as you know, in Gauteng, and particularly in Pretoria, we have lots and lots of jacaranda trees, which were imported, as you know, from South America, I think, but they kind of become almost part of the whole Pretoria and certainly part of Johannesburg's landscape. And the tradition was that when the first blossoms start falling, then the senior student, who was called the Beagle, he would go knock on the door of the chief instructor and say, the blossoms have fallen. And that means that we had the rest of the day off. And the tradition was that we would fill up a big, like a soup pot from the kitchen with some unimaginable combination of other alcoholic beverages. And we'd have a trolley from the kitchen, and we'd trundle this trolley around from rondavel to rondavel. And then each student's name plate would be hammered up on the cupboard in their room. And needless to say, we started out with commandants from A to Z, and then majors from A to Z. So I was major A. And so I was sort of halfway through the evening when it was my turn to have my nameplate hammered into the cupboard. And by then, a lot of the guys were broken, shattered, perhaps, some of them. And somebody decided that it was, because I had freckles, you probably can't see it now, but I was very freckled when I was younger, that my nameplate couldn't go plain. Somebody had to hammer in little freckles into the nameplate. So if you ever go back to rondavel number 3 at the Army College, you'll see that Adams's nameplate from 1982, it's got a whole lot of dents and scratches and all kinds of things in, because the guys felt it was appropriate that my little nameplate would be decorated correctly. The other thing which was brilliant was that a lot of the exercises that we did were done very, very professionally. And we were actually often given opportunities to do air photo recce's. And what happened was they would divide the students into syndicates, and each one would be given a job for a particular operation. And there's one particular one. Once again, my friend Brian Regan was with me, and he was I think I was the commanding general for the exercise, and he was my senior staff officer intelligence. And we'd done our appreciations. We even went on an air photo recce, and we decided that we knew the area pretty well, but we needed to check some stuff out. So we decided to be quite cheeky, and we booked ourselves for a round of golf on a golf course in Nelspruit. And thinking that we were very clever and that we'd got away with everything, halfway through the course, we looked, and the guys on the other fairway were some of the instructors. And by that stage, it was very far in the course. So we kind of looked at each other and smiled, and they smiled at us, and we let the issue kind of be buried. But actually, the exercises were very, very well prepared. The one, I can't remember the name of the exercise, but it was they actually apparently flew real-time air reconnaissance in Angola for this particular exercise. And as it happened, I was once again, for my sins, I was the commanding general, and Eddie Falloon was the senior staff officer operations, and there was another guy, I think it was Jean Lausberg, who was SSO intelligence, senior staff officer intelligence. So what we did is we got these air photos from the reconnaissance from the jets that had flown the actual live reconnaissance in Angola, and we based our appreciation and our plan on those air photos. And what was really brilliant about it was that the following year in Operation Askari, which I'll talk about in a moment, my battalion, which I went to eventually, was 201 Battalion. The three targets that we had in Askari were Nahoni, Mupa, and Ivali. And those were the three targets that I'd actually appreciated in my in that exercise. And lo and behold, Eddie Falloon did Kuvalai and Techumete, which is the targets that 3-2 Battalion had in Operation Askari the following year. And I remember telling an Israeli friend of mine, he said to me, how did that work out, that you guys were kind of like, I said, well, that's the way we worked. We were so jacked up and so professional that this was all planned. They knew that we were, of course, it's nonsense, because they didn't know at the time that I was going to the Bushmen. They certainly perhaps knew that Eddie was going, but it was one of those amazing things where, once again, having been at Mupa in Protea, I was once again in Mupa and Ivali and Nahoni during Askari, and it was like coming back to my own back garden because I knew it so well. So we were very well prepared, and we were very well looked after. The other thing which was amazing during that year was that, as I told you earlier, I had been given a kind of an idea that I would be going to Special Forces headquarters. And to this day, I don't know why, because I was not a qualified operator. But one day I got a message delivered to me in class that I had to meet the director of infantry at the silver tank outside the building. And I think on the photograph that I sent you, you'll see the silver tank quite clearly. And I thought, well, this is extremely clandestine. You know, why can't he just come to see me in my rondavel? What's the story going on here? And he said to me, no, Chief of the Army has decided that you're going to 201 Battalion. And I said, what's 201 Battalion? He said, no, it's 3-1 Battalion. It's just been renamed. And then I thought, wow, this is amazing. This is really exceptional, something to look forward to. And as it actually happened, it must have been towards the end of that year. We had, maybe around about October, November, we had a reunion from the Ondangwa Oshikati guys at Brigadier Bernardi, as he was then, at his house in Centurion. And we were all crying and swimming around the swimming pool. We all had our families and kids there. And Kat Liebenberg, who was director of operations, was there. Oh, no, he was, at that time, he had already become the GOC of Special Forces. And he was swimming with us and everything. And he grabbed my little girl, who was about 4 at that stage, and put her on his knee. And he said to her, this man, he's talking to Force Bernardi, this man wants you to go to the Bushmen, but I want you to come and work for me. I want him to come and work for me in Special Forces. What do you think your dad should do? And she said to him, my dad wants to go to the bush. So he picked her up and he handed her to Force Bernardi, and he said, you can send him to the Bushmen. And I hasten to add, I hope that's not how strategic decisions were taken in the army, but we all subsequently had a good laugh about it when we talked about it. But that's how the final decision was apparently taken. And after the end of the course, we all had to start preparing ourselves for our new lives and our new jobs. And it had been a tough year because I was based in Cape Town. My wife actually stayed with her sister in Krugersdorp for part of the year until we were able to buy a little house in Vierde Park. And then we had some semblance of a family life for the last 6 months or so, until we had to once again pack up. We had to rent our house and get ready to go to the border. But before we did that, we had to attend a course which was called the the new OC and RSM's course. So all the guys who had been promoted to positions where they were going to become battalion commanders or whatever, and RSMs, we had a course at the Army College for about a week. And it was really just to tell us about all the important stuff that we had to know about our new lives and so on. And at that stage, having come from the SACC battalion, there was an expectation, certainly by a lot of the guys from the SACC, that I would come back after staff course as the commander. And I'll never forget one of the guys, a guy by the name of Barney Links, a colored guy who was the commander of the maintenance unit, the Cape Corps maintenance unit. I can't remember what it was called, SACC maintenance unit, a loggy. And when one of the guys said to him during the course, "Why isn't Adams going back to SACC?" He said, "No. Look, the generals have obviously decided that he needs to spend a couple of years with our forefathers to learn more about us, and then after that he'll come back to Cape Town." And I always thought it was quite a mature and quite a funny attitude to have from Barney, and we stayed in contact ever since then. So anyway, that was a year, and I could tell you so much more about that course. It was absolutely mind-boggling and an absolute privilege. But early in December 1982, my wife and I and Lauren, who was by that stage about 3.5, got on a flossie from Waterkloof to Mapacha, which is next to Katima Malilu. And we weren't allowed to have cars there at Amiga. We weren't allowed to have a lot of stuff. Everything was furnished, so we were allowed to have a couple of boxes of our own, obviously our own personal stuff and clothing and things like that, which were with us on the plane, and some of it which was sent ahead, I think, if I can remember correctly. And anyway, we arrived at Mapacha, which is about 200 kilometers from Amiga. Now, if you can imagine a map of the north of Namibia as it is today, you'll see that long strip there in the north, which is called the Caprivi Strip. I'm not going to go into detail about where the history and all that. That's perhaps a story for another day. But our base was right in the middle of the Caprivi Strip, about 200 kilometers from Mapacha, 200 kilometers from Katima Malilu, and right in the middle of nothing, basically. So my 2IC Lib picked us up at the airport. He was wonderful, brilliant. I mean, he made us feel so welcome in this old 10-seater Land Rover, which was spotlessly cleaned. And we loaded our kit in there and off we went. But what I didn't know and what we didn't know, that it was the middle of summer, it was early in December. It was blistering hot. It was humid. The road was completely potholed because of the rains and because of basically some flooding that had actually taken place. And it was a hell of a drive. 200 kilometers along this mud road. And we had a flat tire along the way as well, which dear old Lib got out, and he changed the tire on his own so that I wouldn't have to get dirty. And one of the doors actually fell off this vehicle halfway back to Amiga. So we had quite a baptism of fire, if you like, along the way. But eventually we got to the most beautiful, beautiful place. I think I've got a photo of the entrance to Amiga. You can see the white road, the Concrete Road, and there was a turn off to this place. And my wife and I kind of looked at each other. We didn't know what we'd let ourselves in for. But within a couple of 100 meters off that road, we got to this absolute paradise. Under hundreds and hundreds of trees was this base called Amiga Base, and it was going to be our home for the next 3 years. And my predecessors and I took a kind of a pledge that not one single tree would be cut down in that base at all and at any time. And in fact, it was beautiful to see that, in fact, in a lot of buildings, including in our church, the roof had actually been built around the tree, and that even wrapped tube for car tire or vehicle tire tube around the tree, so that if the wind blew, that it wouldn't damage the roof or it wouldn't damage the tree. And so we were very strict on that. We were also strict on preservation of game, of wildlife. I personally made a lot of effort to have all the trees named, and improve the bird lists. I became quite a birder. We also looked at all the animals and stuff that were in and around that area. I often used to take my daughter, when I used to go out into the training area, I used to take my daughter with me, and we would see lion tracks and leopard tracks, all kinds of stuff, although we didn't see much of that actually in our base. But I was met and greeted by Franz Burtis and his wife Anneke, and they made us feel extremely welcome. So much so that he'd actually vacated the commandant's house, and they'd cleaned it up and they'd got it ready for us, and he was living in one of our guest Kimbo. They had little huts there made of wood, which were called Kimbos. And most of us lived in Kimbos. The Bushman families lived in Kimbos, and the single guys lived in Kimbos. And other than that, we had some modern mobile homes. My house was basically a tarpaulin house with IBR, which had some paneling eventually, which we put in. And we had one air conditioner in our house, which was an absolute saving grace, because the temperatures there used to go absolutely moggy, absolutely crazy. But Franz and Anneke vacated their house, and we were able to settle in very nicely. Franz, I'll never forget, he really went out of his way to make me feel welcome. I'll never forget, one day we were sitting around the swimming pool, because we had 3 swimming pools, one for the officers, one for the warrant officers and NCOs, and one for the troops. And it was like being in a 5-star resort. It was absolutely mind-bogglingly beautiful. And one day we were sitting there, and Franz got up and he said, "The last one in the swimming pool is a Cuban." And he dived into the swimming pool and came out with his head just pouring, the blood pouring out of the poor guy's head. And he'd obviously, in a moment of over-enthusiasm, had hit his head on the side of the pool, and poor old Franz had a couple of stitches in his head. And it didn't diminish his enthusiasm, because he was very, very kind and polite. The one thing that I will never forget is that one of the perks that I had was I had one, the 2IC had one, and the RSM had one, a Honda 250R Scrambler. And although I had a bike, or had been riding a bike when I was a kid in Cape Town, a 50cc, that was on tar roads. And I wasn't used to driving on thick white sand roads, which was the par for the course up there at that particular time. So Franz took it upon himself to train me as a competent motorbike rider. And I must say, he and I had some serious laughs about that, because he would take me out of the base to show me all around and where everything was and everything. And he says sometimes he'd look around and he'd see me come shooting across the road and disappear into the bush. And a couple of minutes later, I'd come out again and hit the road for a while until the sand got a little bit dodgy, and I'd shoot off into the bush again. So we had some seriously good laughs about that. And I can't imagine what my life there would have been like without the motorbike, because it enabled me to get around amazingly. I'll never forget one thing. One day, my RSM and I were waiting for some VIPs to arrive at our airport. We had a very big airport there, and it was a strategic airport, because it not only supplied a lot of our operations in and around that area in the early days, but it became the hub for Savimbi support. So we had a lot of hush-hush visitors and people that were using it as a through route on their way to go and visit Savimbi. Anyway, this one particular day, we got a message to say we needed to meet some VIPs at the airport in a jet. And my RSM and I were waiting under a tree on our little scramblers. And this jet kept on coming. It didn't seem to have brakes. And we suddenly realized that we were in for some sports here. And the jet didn't stop in time to meet the end of the runway. And on the other side of the runway, we had a cricket field, a soccer field, cricket field, which was calcrete. And then we had some thick sand. And then we had the Kandandos, which are the old Bushman soldiers, which were like the pensioners. They had their tents there. So this jet went over the soccer field, through the thick sand of the kind of like no man's land, and then into some of the tents. And the story goes, and apparently there was a story published in Paratus, that RSM and I drove our bikes up, and there were these guys crash landed basically in the thick sand, getting out as fast as they can out of this thing with fuel dripping out of the one wing. And apparently I saluted them very smartly and said, "Good afternoon, Brigadier. I hope you had a very good flight." And I thought it was the appropriate thing to do at the time, but apparently in retrospect it wasn't. So anyway, to cut a long story short, the Brigadier said, "What's the time now?" And I said, "It's 3:00. He said, "Well, let's go and open the pub." So we went over to the pub because I think they were all a bit shaken up about this crash landing that they had. So my scrambler was a very, very important part of my survivability for the 3 years that I was there. The other great thing that we had, the tradition that I inherited, was we had a beautiful little black badge with a white crow emblem on it. And to be able to wear that, you had to do a 35-kilometer walk. Walk perhaps is the wrong word, but a march, 35-kilometer march with skeleton webbing and rifle and whatever. And my RSM was older than me, and I said to him, "Look, RSM, it's the middle of summer. I'm certainly not going to walk in the middle of the daytime. I suggested you and I use a bit of rank hazards privilege, RHIP, and we walk at nighttime." And he said, "Well, I think that's an excellent idea, sir. You can't do it on your own. I'll accompany you, and we'll get one or two other chaps to do it." And one of the other guys was a dentist who had recently been posted, and he also wanted to qualify. So the three of us set out after dark, were dropped off 35 kilometers away, and we had to walk back into the base. But in retrospect, perhaps walking in the daytime, although it would have been a hell of a lot hotter, would have been a lot safer, because we hadn't gone more than about 10 Ks when we noticed there was a group of hyenas that were following us. And I had to cock my rifle at one stage because they were right 2 or 3, 4, 5 meters away from us. And we managed not to have to fire a shot at them, but we had this group of hyenas following us all the way back for at least 15 or 20 kilometers. But we eventually arrived at the base at about 6 o'clock in the morning, and I was buggered. I can tell you that right now. I was exhausted, because it wasn't just walking on in the normal bush. It was walking on white sand on a white tweespoor, on a 2-track road. And you know what it's like walking on them. You take a step forward and you slide backwards. So it was. But anyway, we all had to go through that process, and I very, very proudly wore that badge. What I did change, I added a couple of things to it. The one was that you had to have a clean disciplinary record. So if at any time you messed up, your badge could be suspended until you'd sorted yourself out, and then you'd be given your badge back again. And the other thing which I introduced was a battalion history exam, and you had to get 90% in that exam. And that was all about the history of the Bushmen, where they came from, the history of the battalion, who were the previous commanders and RSMs, and all those other kind of good things. So as it happened, on Christmas Day 1982, I proudly became the 4th commanding officer of the Bushman Battalion at the age of 30. And I knew that it was a privilege, but I didn't actually know what a great privilege it was actually going to be, because that 3-year journey was a journey that was going to change my life in many, many respects. I met so many people. I had the privilege of serving with some outstanding officers and other ranks in the battalion, and people that I met along the way. And so it was a mind-boggling experience. Perhaps I should just say, for people that don't know, that the reason why the Bushmen were there was because in and before Operation Savannah in 1975, the first commander of 3-1 Battalion, as it was then, was a guy by the name of Delbert Linford. He was a legend, absolute legend. And it was decided that because the Bushmen, who were basically being very badly treated by the communists in Angola, that we as South Africans needed to try and protect them. And it was eventually decided that we would bring them back to the Caprivi, we would house them, secure them, provide them with some kind of future, and that we would use them as soldiers, because a lot of them had been used by the Portuguese secret police, and they were called the flechas, which meant the arrows. And so it was very important to actually to understand where they came from. And there were two types of Bushmen. There was the Vasekele, who are the shorter, more sort of yellowy brown guys that we kind of, if you think Bushmen, you think of those little guys. And then the others were which are also called the river Bushmen, which are the Barakwena. Some people call them the Barakwengas, but anyway, we call them the Barakwena. They're taller, they're darker, and they get along very well with each other generally. But we had two companies of Vasekele and two companies of Barakwena, and they were actually quite competitive. And leading them were South Africans, white South Africans, as it happens, and those were from me, the RSM, and all the other senior staff, company commanders were basically white South Africans. So we had a problem with language, because most of these guys actually were Portuguese speaking, and of course their own language. And although some guys claimed to have been able to speak one of the Bushman languages, I very much doubt it, because I made a serious effort when I got there to try and learn it. But like I was to discover later when I got to Taiwan and to experience the journey of learning Mandarin, Bushman languages are tonal languages. So a word, like the one I always talk about, is the word ko, which could mean smoking pipe. It could mean I'm angry with you. There's another meaning which I can't remember for them. So the way you said ko, the way you intoned it, had a different meaning. So it could become extremely dangerous. But that's not a cop-out, but it was a very, very difficult language to learn. So the lingua franca of the battalion was basically Afrikaans. And that, you can imagine, led to a whole lot of interesting things, because the language that the South African soldiers spoke included a lot of swear words. The F word particularly was a very, very popular adjective. And so when the Bushmen spoke to us, they would include a lot of very picturesque adjectives. And whether they spoke to a woman or a general or anybody else, that was the way they spoke the language. And, a lot of people criticized us and said, how could you possibly do this? You're corrupting these guys, you're doing all kinds of other nasty things. But it's just the way it worked out. And so we had 4 companies, A, B, C, D, 2 Barakwena companies, 2 Vasekele companies, and we had a reconnaissance wing. That was our pride and joy. It was really underutilized. We had some outstanding people in there. The one, Koos Stadler, he's written a couple of books. He was an outstanding soldier. He was the wing commander. Neil Reynolds, another great soldier that eventually did other great things outside of our battalion. So we had this nucleus of highly trained guys. Some of them were parachute trained, and they used to do all kinds of weird and wonderful and interesting things. But unfortunately, they were not utilized as much and as well as they possibly should have been. So on the one hand, we had an operational battalion with great expectations about how we should succeed and how we should work and how we should operate. And on the other hand, as the commander, I was the mayor of a town of 4,000 people. So it was one of those interesting jobs where my purpose was as a battalion commander, where I had a specific operational task and a very challenging one, because as I said, there were great things expected of us. But on the other hand, I had all this admin and log of running this little town, with all the things that you can imagine happened in and around this particular town. So, it wasn't just something which which, you know, if you went to an ordinary infantry battalion, you would have your soldiering job to do, and the rest would just kind of like fall into place. So from an operational point of view, because that's really what we were about, we were very proudly one of the better operational battalions. And I hate to compare us to anybody, because we were all unique. Each of the battalions were unique. 101 was unique, 32 was unique, 31201 was unique. Our soldiers were not the same as 101 or 32. They didn't have the same mentality. They didn't have the same skills. They weren't as big and as strong as some of the 32 guys were. And to expect us to be compared against somebody like 32, I have the greatest respect for 32. I, in fact, served with them, as you know, in Protea. I was with Battle Group 60, and I got to work with them. They were our neighbors in the Caprivi, so I got to know them and worked for them. But we had a different role to play. We had a different job to do. Our Bushmen were trackers, particularly. They had other skills, and they had other things which they were very, very good at, which nobody else could do, we think, as well as we could do. So our job was reaction force, Romeo Mikes, as they were called, reaction force. We had teams in Buffels initially, and eventually in Caspers. And our job was to pick up tracks, follow the tracks, call in air support if and when necessary, and follow the tracks to contact and have contacts and kill as many enemy as we possibly could. And the way we worked is that we had 2 companies that were deployed in Novemberland at the time, 2 that stayed home, 6 weeks in, 6 weeks out. And the one thing that I realized when I took over was that I wanted to put my stamp on the fact that I wanted to make sure that we weren't only known as a great place to go and visit, a beautiful base where people used to come and visit. And I'll tell you in a moment about the visitors we used to have, because we used to have thousands of visitors a year from South Africa. And we got a bit of a reputation as being a holiday resort. And I took over, and I decided that I wanted to put a stamp back on the battalion as being a very successful operational battalion. But the problem was that our companies that were operating in Novemberland, a lot of them were orphans, in the sense that the company was just deployed in one of the 5-1, 5-2, 5-3, or 5-4, and there was no top cover for them. There was nobody to look after them. And although most of the commanders were great, and they really liked them, and they looked after them, and they cared for them, there were a couple of guys that didn't. There were a couple of guys that didn't want them, they didn't like them, and they were actually quite badly treated. So the fact, I decided that I was going to change the way we did things, and I arranged with my OC at the time that we would divide the battalion into 2 little battle groups of 2 companies each, and I would take one, and my 2RC would take one, and I would spend 6 weeks in and 6 weeks back at Amiga, and he would do the same. And I was able to arrange that we would take over a Congo base, which is in the far east of Novemberland. Very, very active area. It had almost become liberated, although nobody will believe me when I say that. But before we took over, there'd been an incident where some SWAPO had actually come on top of the walls of the sand walls of the base and actually fired into the base. So we knew that we had a lot of cleaning up to do when we got there, and we turned that area around in the time that I was there. I can't mention the stats, but it was a great success story. And the fact that I was there in person meant that I was able to negotiate a better deal for the support we got and all those kind of things. I think it also sent a good message to the guys that I cared about the operational chaps, and it wasn't just something that we dumped. So we kept going with that for a while. It wasn't really a sustainable model, because although I was the commander of the battalion, my overall responsibility was a lot more than just sitting in a camp for 6 weeks, because I didn't go out on vehicles very often, because that wasn't my role. We had company commanders that were doing that job. So although it was great from a point of view of leading and setting an example, it was not a sustainable model. So although we carried on with the model, I withdrew myself after the first couple of tours and established one of the other majors became the other battle group commander or whatever, combat team commander, whatever it was. And we carried on with the model going forward. One thing I can say is that the one thing that I'm delighted, and also the fact that I'm very happy to say that I've got a lot of contact with a lot of the lieutenants and even some of the corporals and sergeants that served with me at that time. And in fact, you know, one of the benefits of having a national service army, as we had in those days, that the quality of the junior leaders that we got was absolutely mind-boggling. Some of the chaps that I had working with me or serving with me, you could never have recruited them if you'd only had permanent force people. Because some of the guys were chartered accountants, were eventually ended up being director of companies, and some of the guys that I'm still in contact with were absolutely outstanding. One of the problems I had, though, was every year we used to go down, or twice a year, down to the infantry school. We had to go and so-called select the junior leaders. And it was really one of the most unscientific, subjective things, because what used to happen was 3-2 would be there, I'd be there, the Parabats would be there, 101 would be there, and then we'd sit on the stand in the rugby stadium, and guys would come up and say they'd like to join. And how do you evaluate them on the basis of a 2-minute discussion on sitting on the rugby stand? So what we did is we followed the rule of it probably sounds like nepotism, but if a guy had a brother or a cousin that had been with us before, and the guy said, "No, that's a good oak," then he would get fast-tracked up the list. And it was amazing that even though it was a completely unscientific thing, it seemed to work out very nicely. I think I'm going to tell you a story later about what we used to do when they used to arrive, but I'll leave that until later. And then lo and behold, at the end of my first year, in 1983, we had this fantastic opportunity to set about Operation Askari. And the purpose of Operation Askari was that we wanted to nip SWAPO in the bud in terms of their normal annual summer invasion of the eastern side of Avambuland, and we wanted to just proactively deal with them before they got there. And Echo, Victor, Eddie Viljoen, and 3-2 Battalion and a couple of other guys were given the opportunity to target Kuvalai and eventually Techimatet. And we as the Bushmen had to go in and make sure that Nahoni, Ivali, and Mupo were safe. And then we patrolled the area south of Kuvalai to make sure that any other elements that were either trying to interfere with or to escape from the other operations in the north, that we could deal with them. And we had a very, very successful time as well in that area. And as I said earlier, it was a wonderful opportunity for me, because in those days, battalion commanders never got the opportunity to command their whole battalion. The battalion commander would look after the base, and he would send his companies in and around. So what we did, Alpha and Charlie Company were already operating in that area. And I got my orders from Oshikati, and I flew into Angiva at the time, where we were assembling to go into the area. And I arrived there that afternoon, and my RSM was there, and he sorted the whole place out. He had a big poikie going, and I was able to give orders and brief my guys. And we had a couple of drinks, and we had this beautiful poikie that the RSM had made. And he said to me, "Let me show you to your room." And lo and behold, in this bombed out airport building at Anjiva, there was a lovely room with a bed, white sheets, no windows and doors, but it was nice and spotlessly clean and everything, and ready for me. So after we'd had our dinner, I said to the guys, "Look, I've got a little bit of work to do." And I went to my room, and in a short while I was fast asleep. But unbeknown to me, there were anti-aircraft guns that had been positioned around Anjiva, and especially around the airport building. And unbeknown to me, there was one right outside the room where I was sleeping. So these buggers had actually set me up, because what they'd done is that they waited until I was fast asleep, and then they opened up with this 35 mil next to my bed, basically. And apparently I levitated like that off my bed. Anyway, to cut a long story short, we opened the pub again after that, and I had another couple of nightcaps, and we chatted, and then we all disappeared back to bed. So the next morning, Bravo and Delta Company deployed. They made sure that Nahoni and Ivali and Mupa were taken care of. And then the small headquarter element and I flew in helicopters, and we took over the little town of Mupa, which was right on the main line for logistics, and we established ourselves there. And as I said earlier, I'd been there in Protea. I knew that little place like the back of my hand. And what was amazing, of course, that big tree where I'd had my headquarters in Protea, that was still there. But any other trace of where our trenches had been and everything a year and a half before was gone. There was no trace of it at all. And I've included a photograph of our headquarters that we established in Mupa. It was an old Portuguese house, beautiful tiled floors, which we had to clean out and clean up, and that became our base. We had, there's a beautiful kopje there right behind the house, and there was a breeding pair of black eagles that lived there. So it was an amazing kind of vibe that happened there, but it became a logistics space. We had these huge diesel and Avta fuel tanks, cushion tanks. So all the vehicles that were going up and down were obviously being replenished and things like that over there. But we had our headquarters, which we obviously, like soldiers always do, we made it into as comfortable a place as we possibly could. And one of my youngsters, a signaller by the name of Morris Brett, he got a parcel in the post, and in the parcel was a little tape recorder with a couple of tapes that his mom had sent him. And one of the tapes was Up Where We Belong with Joe Cocker and what's the name? I think I might have Jennifer Warnes. And Up Where We Belong became our theme song because of the Eagles, where eagles fly, and blah, 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 blah. And eventually one of the company commanders got on the radio and said to me, Commandant, please stop playing that music, because every time we talk to you on the radio, we can hear this song in the background. Please find another song to play, because we're getting sick and tired of hearing this song the whole time. But, you know, apart from all the hard work that went on, there were quite a lot of funny things that happened. The one was there was an old Portuguese oven, an outside oven, which my RSM and our chef Aubrey, who is now a chef on Rovos Rail, and Aubrey and the RSM went down to the river and got some clay, and they fixed this beautiful outside oven, and they used to bake these beautiful loaves of bread. So our reaction force teams, when they rotated to get their diesel and stuff, when they came in, they'd all get fresh rations and a beautiful loaf of bread and things like that. The other thing which they did was they were always trying to pull a trick on me, especially the Bushmen. They loved, but I think that probably because they saw that I was the kind of guy that used to kind of enjoy this the thing. You know, I didn't really respond in a negative way to it. And in this little building that you've seen the picture of, there's you come out of the door and there's a stoop, and you turn right, there's some steps going down, and then you're out on the ground. And they called me out one day and they said, Commandant, you must come and have a look at something. And I walked out, and as I turned right, there was this black mamba. I didn't know it at the time, but it was dead, and they draped it over the stoop and over the steps. And apparently I broke the Southern Angola long jump record, because apparently I jumped about 3 meters from a standing start right over the snake. And you can imagine, the Bushmen laughed, the soldiers, my guys laughed, everybody had a good laugh. But a couple of days later, I got my revenge, because we went out on a little patrol to the mission station, which I'll tell you about in a moment. And while we were bundi bashing, we didn't drive on the road because of mine, so we just bundi bashed through the thick bush, and it was very thick bush there. I was, I think, in the second vehicle or the third vehicle, and I was looking at this buffalo in front of me, and the roll bar hit a big branch, And because we were Bundabash, we were all standing up in the vehicle, and this huge snake was knocked out of this tree in the vehicle in front of me, and it fell into this buffle. And within seconds, it was I can see it in my mind's eye. These little soldiers, little Bushman guys, diving out of the back of these buffles because of this huge snake was in there. So I guess I got the last laugh on that particular snake. We also had a lot of sadness around that mission station. I was actually disgusted when I got there because there was obviously a lot of conflict of interest between the Roman Catholic Church, the missions, and us, because they certainly were never allies of ours. But when I got to this old mission building, I was actually disgusted to see how it had been vandalized. And it wasn't only SWAPO and FAPLA that had vandalized it. There was some clear markings that it had been some of our national service units that had also done their bit. And there were damaged science lab equipment, smashed. Everything was smashed. And the church tower, the steeple in the tower was hanging precariously. So we arranged to take down the church bell before it fell down. And we took it back to Amiga, and it eventually took up pride of place in our church at Amiga. In retrospect, we probably should have arranged to have it taken back there at some stage, but maybe somebody will do it, somebody has done, but I certainly don't know about it. But I was disgusted with this, and as I walked back to my vehicle, with my flat sole of my boot, I kicked the frame of a roundabout that was in the like a kids' play area, and I heard this thing going and going and going, and when I got to my vehicle, I stopped and I probably lit up a cigarette because I was still smoking in those days. And I looked back, and this thing just kept on going. It was so beautifully and perfectly made that it just kept on going for a long time. So there was a lot of effort and stuff put into that mission station, unfortunately, which a lot of our guys messed up and so on at the time. There were also some other incidents where one of my, the other thing which I need to tell you that I'll talk about it now. We had at Amiga, we had a couple of schools. We had the Bushman School, and we had the Adult Education Center. And we used to get qualified teachers that were sent up to work in the Bushman School and in the Adult Education Center. And those guys were all ex-infantry school. They were full lieutenants, they were qualified teachers, but they were not deployed to be platoon commanders. And there was always this huge urging and desire on their part to become platoon commanders. So I tried where I could to accommodate these. And there was this one particular guy, I won't mention his name, but I gave him a chance, an opportunity to command a platoon. And he had a very bad incident. I don't think anybody was killed on his vehicle, but there were a couple of guys that were hospitalized because they hit a mine in the buffle. And he got such a shock when it happened that he actually fainted and fell out of the back of the vehicle. And he was rattled. And the logical thing would have been to withdraw the guy and send him back to South Africa or send him back to Amiga and get somebody else to do the job. But I spoke to my RSM who was with me, and I said, let's give it let's look at it from a different perspective and give the guy an opportunity. So I said, when he comes in later for his re-rationing and getting his vehicles filled up and things like that, why don't you take him aside and kind of a chat to this lieutenant? Because the RSM was older. He was like almost a father figure to a lot of the guys. And I remember 2 cans of beer in each hand, his arm around the lieutenant, and they disappeared into one of the old ruined buildings. And about an hour later, I saw the lieutenant come jogging out of the bush, got back on his vehicle, off he went, never looked back. And, it would have really ruined the youngster if I just said to him, you failed, off you go, gave him another opportunity. So my RSM, he was a bit of an unsung hero. He was one of those guys that perhaps should have been rewarded more for the work that he did, because in his own way, he did such a lot of stuff in terms of building his esprit de corps and things like that in the unit. We also had a problem a little bit later on we were running out of cigarettes very badly because we weren't getting the supplies in that we should have got in. And one day we heard that our stuff was coming. There's a big ration truck, a convoy that was coming. But unbeknown to us, the convoy with our particular vehicle, it was on a quail, it was on a big Sama 100, but it had a mine-proof cab, hit a landmine. And although the crew of the vehicle were fine, everything on the back of the 10-ton truck, including our cigarettes, were blown up. But we noticed that when the convoy arrived, there were a lot of UNITA guys there who had been protecting the convoy. They were all smoking Chesterfields and all kinds of stuff. So we knew where our precious cigarettes had gone to. So yeah, that was Operation Ascari. And in the history of South Africa, it was a very successful operation. And we weren't involved in the fighting at Kuvalai and Tetramatet and those things. That was 3 Battalion. But I think we were used in the role that we were best suited to fulfill. And I think I was very, very proud of the way that we operated. And of course, the fact that I was given an opportunity to actually command all 4 of my companies at that particular operation was brilliant. Then, as I mentioned, being the OC of 201 Battalion, 31 Battalion, wasn't just an operational job. There was a little village, a little town that I was responsible for. And I was held responsible for it. I mean, it was almost like sort of a bipolar kind of thing, because on the one hand, we had these great expectations in terms of us as a fighting unit. On the other hand, we had all this admin and stuff that we had to deal with. And as I mentioned before, our houses were specific and particular. And one of the things I did, because the Bushman houses were just one room basically, is we got a guy called Jan from Grootfontein. He was a builder, and we got him started making cement bricks. And we got a whole lot of the ex-servicemen Bushmen who were retired into the brick making business. And with those bricks, he started making closed stoops on all these wooden huts, all these wooden kimbos. And so that not only provided employment for a lot of these guys, but it provided the soldier with a kind of a more socially acceptable little house where he had a bit of privacy. He had a little kitchen in there, and he was able to have a kind of a more normal life. He was able eventually to buy himself a fridge, buy himself a little stove, and have a sort of a better kind of living than he would normally have had. We had a beautiful sick bay that was built just before I arrived, opened just before I arrived. We had 3 doctors and a dentist and a couple of sisters. And it was called the Sikitali because that was a combination between sick bay and hospital. And a lot of the words that we had in those days were words that were made up by the Bushmen, because they decided that it was not the Sikkerbuch and it wasn't the Hospitali, it was the Sikitali. And that became the Sikitali. And it was a huge culture shock, because Bushman children were born in the bush. When the woman had to give birth to the child, she would go into the bush and give birth and bring the child back into the base again. And we had a big problem because a lot of the children were dying. There was the infant mortality rate was very high. And we had to find a way of getting the women to register their babies. And one of the guys came up with a brilliant idea, because we had a beer rationing. The soldiers couldn't buy as much beer as they wanted. They could only buy 2 beers a day. But if you registered your baby, you got 10 beers, bonus. So needless to say, we didn't have any problems about getting babies registered. The other thing which we had a problem with was they saw a lot of the white women were bottle feeding their babies. And they didn't understand that the bottles had to be sterilized. They had to be boiled, and the formula had to be properly prepared and all that kind of thing. And we had a lot of deaths in the first couple of weeks until we decided to deal with this issue. And one of the issues was that the sisters, of course, had to go into the company lines and tell the women that there's a procedure that you've got to deal with it. But the other way is that we had to set an example. And my wife Jackie was the head of the Adult Education Center, and she was training a lot of the Bushman women in literacy skills. And we'd just had our second baby, our second daughter at that time. So I said to her, well, I'm sorry for you, but you're going to have to set an example about breastfeeding so that when you're teaching, because they used to have a little cloth that the baby used to hang in, and then the baby could just breastfeed at will. So I said to my wife, get yourself one of those little things and hang Nicola in there and let them see that the commandant's wife breastfeeds her baby. So there's nothing bad about it. If the commandant's wife can breastfeed her baby, then we should all be breastfeeding our babies. So needless to say, with a combination of her setting an example and the sisters doing their job, it went very, very well. We had a bakery started by one of the Portuguese women that was there right in the very beginning. We made beautiful Portuguese pau, Portuguese rolls, which became a cornerstone of our whole sort of culture at Amiga. The food and rations, everything was provided by the state. My predecessor had the foresight to build a beautiful supermarket, which was eventually taken over by the South African Defence Force Institute, SAVI or SADFI. And eventually we were able to buy other stuff there, like appliances, clothing, and some basic household requirements. But the Bushmen and us, we got all our food delivered by aeroplane and by convoys. And that was quite exciting. And in fact, if I do the third session, I can perhaps tell you some stories about some really funny things that happened. But the one thing that was amazing with that, and one of the culture things that is so different from us, we had a 10-ton truck that was delivering rations to Mapacha or somewhere, and it rolled quite close to, on the main road, quite close to our base. And the loggies decided that some of the cans had got quite badly damaged. They would write off the whole truckload. So we sent out guys, and they picked up all the cans, dumped them in the shade in the middle of our base. And we said to the families, don't take any broken cans, but if there's anything that you can salvage there, help yourselves. Now, if it had been us, white people, we would have all rushed in there, loaded up as much as we possibly can, and got a wheelbarrow even, and taken as much as we possibly can home. Not these guys. And it's a huge lesson I learned from them, is that it's like in their hunting as well. They don't overhunt. They hunt what they need. They take what they need. So what they did for the next couple of weeks, that pile of canned food just diminished slowly, because every day they'd come along and take a can, and somebody else would come along and take a can, or maybe 2 cans. But it wasn't like us, where it was a rush to see how much we could get and take home with us. They just took as much as they needed, which was an interesting experience for me. As I mentioned, we had our schools. We had our Bushman school, which was an absolutely brilliant setup. We had excellent teachers. In fact, I was in contact with the one guy who was the headmaster at the school. He's an extremely successful businessman living in Hong Kong. In fact, I think he's just been transferred to a new position in India. And that's the caliber of youngster we had working in our school in those days. And they taught them sport. In fact, some of the Bushman kids actually ran in the Comrades Marathon. We arranged for a group of them to actually come down to South Africa one winter, and a couple of them and some of the soldiers ran in the Comrades Marathon. We also had a craft center. Initially some of the Bushman women, some of the Portuguese women that came down started teaching them to sew, and my predecessor's wife actually did quite a lot of work on building the craft center. We had the Adult Education Center. My wife was a qualified teacher. She got a couple of degrees, so she was a qualified teacher trainer. She went to Anglo, went to a couple of prisons, and learned how to specifically train literacy. And one of our targets was to get every person, every soldier at least, to be able to sign his name. Because we thought that it would be, because they had to sign for their pay every month. And most of them used to make a cross. And it was a demeaning, we thought it was a demeaning thing. So we got them at least to the stage where they could at least write their own names. And my wife and her team of teachers did an amazing job, not only with the women, but also with some of the soldiers, especially those that were in a senior position, to make them feel give them a little bit more self-pride and a little bit more status, where they could actually become literate and read and write and so on. So that was brilliant. We also had a problem with the soldiers' salaries, because it was an impossible task to have all this money and this cash moving around. And it was long before we had EFTs and all those kind of things. It was cash that had to be moved. And because the Bushmen were the way they are, they wanted to see all their money. So, if they got paid, they wanted to see their money. So I decided in my naivety that I was going to make contact with Bank Windhoek, one of the banks in Windhoek, and they agreed that they would come and open a little branch there. And I think once or twice a month, they would come in, fly in, and we'd open the bank, which was a Kimbo that had been converted, basically. There was no security issue there, so it was just a guy with a counter, and he would just... But eventually, I think the guy was declared insane, because he got so sick and tired of that. He would pay the guy, or the guys would be able to draw their money. And instead of just taking what they needed, like 100 Rand or 200 and 300 Rand, they wanted all their money. And once they'd seen all their money, they'd say, okay, you can have it back again. And this guy freaked out. And eventually, after a while, we decided that we had to do things differently. This wasn't really working very well. So it was one of those experiments that we tried, which failed dismally. The other thing which I tried to implement was, I was getting very worried, because the Bushmen, a lot of the Bushman soldiers were getting very old. And we needed to, number one, decide what we were going to do with a lot of the younger guys that were coming through the system, that had finished school. Where were they going to work? What were they going to do? And I thought, well, the way we could do it was we could start training up like a youth wing, where we could start getting them like into an apprentice kind of position, where we could identify those that wanted to actually become soldiers and those that didn't. So my guys that succeeded me actually carried on with that experiment. And it apparently went very well, because we wanted to make sure that the guys didn't lose the skills that their forefathers for perhaps thousands of years had, the ability to track and the ability to do all those kind of things. We had a beautiful church, as I said, which had trees growing through it, which made it even more special. We had pubs and clubs. We had, as I said to you earlier, it was almost like a five-star resort with beautiful lawns around swimming pools. And we had all these old guys, the commandos, they were called. They were the ex-soldiers. A lot of them some of them were wounded. Some of them were just old. And they used to look after the lawns and mow the lawns and plant grass and take care of the hedges. So it was a way of involving them, in some kind of employment, but also keeping their pride in the base and making sure that they felt as if they were part of it. The other thing which was interesting for me was we had one of the senior sergeant of the Baragwanath was a guy by the name of Kamama, and he was a very tall, sturdy, very stately sort of guy, and he had 3 wives. Now the Vasekele only had 1 wife, but the Baragwanath, some of them had more than 1 wife. Different cultures and different ways of looking at things. But because he had 3 wives, he had 3 houses. Each wife had a different wooden kimbo. And one day I was having a chat to him, and I said to him, Kamama, how do you work your admin with having 3 wives, with 3 houses and 3 sets of kids and all that kind of thing? Because each wife used to get rations for her little family, each one. So he said to me, Commandante, he said, 2 nights I sleep with 1 wife, 2 nights I sleep with the other wife, 2 nights I sleep with the 3rd one. And I said, on the 7th day? He says, no. On the 7th day, I take my sleeping bag and I go to the bush for a bit of peace and quiet. So yeah, there were a lot of interesting things that were going on there. I've mentioned the sharing, and I've mentioned the canned food. The language I've also mentioned was a challenge. And although there were some guys that claimed to have had some kind of semblance of language skill, I dispute that. What I also introduced was, because the guys used to come back from ops, and they would normally need a bit of a cooling down period, because we used to have constant disciplinary issues where guys would come back from ops and they'd get completely smashed. They'd fight with I'm talking about the white guys now. They'd fight with each other and whatever. So what we did is at Popper Falls, which is near Bogani, we built a little holiday resort there, a small little place where at the river where the guys could come back from ops, spend 2 or 3 days there, get smashed, swim, unwind, and then come back to the base. And we found that worked extremely well, because it enabled, number one, them to let off some steam, and it enabled us to retain the disciplinary kind of level that we wanted to in the base. The other thing which is quite funny was that one of the things that I tried to introduce was to get my guys a tracker's allowance, because in those days there was a beautiful rattle badge that the guys could wear, and if they were qualified trackers, they would get quite a nice little allowance every month. So we tried to put that through, but we hit a brick wall in terms of the bureaucracy, because even though these guys were arguably the best trackers in the South African Army at that particular time, they all had to go on a course to get qualified. And I mean, it was really quite a ridiculous thing. But anyway, we went along with it, and we sent some guys down to the training school at in Okahanja. And after the first couple of days, I got a phone call from the commander there to say, I'm sending the Bushmen back. I thought, what the hell has happened? What have these guys done again? Anyway, cut a long story short, the first exercise, they sent 2 of the guys out to go and lay a track, and all the students were kind of sitting in the shade. And then after about an hour, the instructor said, right, follow the tracks. And the Bushmen, instead of following the tracks, walked over to a place, it's like 45 degrees away from where the guy started from. And the guy said, what are you guys doing? Here's the tracks. They said, no, we're not going to follow. We've got an idea where they went to, because if it's like an animal, if an animal is wounded, it goes for the water hole. And these guys weren't just thinking in a linear kind of way. They were thinking out of the box. They were saying, where would the guy go? Let's short circuit it. And that's what made us our soldiers so successful, was that they didn't just follow tracks. They did often when they had to, but they would think out of the box, and they would try and find a different way of doing things. So eventually we kind of overcame that with the school, and we reached some kind of agreement. And eventually some of the guys did get qualified as trackers. But it was quite ridiculous to see an 18-year-old national serviceman evaluating a 40-year-old bushman that had been a soldier for 20 years and teaching him how to track. I'm going to try and speed up a little bit, because I don't know how much time I'm taking, but I've got quite a lot to cover still. On the 10th anniversary of the unit in 1984, we decided that we were going to have we called it Crow Weekend. Every October, November, we had the first weekend in November, I think it's called Crow Weekend. And we decided that we were going to thank the previous commanders and their wives, and some of the guys that were the pioneers of the battalion. We were going to hire an L100 from SADF, and we were going to fly a whole lot of people up, a full load of people, and spend a weekend basically of festivities, of Thanksgiving and a medal parade and all those kind of things. And it was a massive success. We had General Mayron, who was not the parade commander, but he was the VIP. And I'll never forget, the whole parade started late because of the rain it started to rain. And we were all standing on parade waiting for the aircraft to arrive, and it landed late because the poor little pilot got lost over Botswana with the general on board. And needless to say, the general was like thunder when he arrived there. But it was a great success. The weekend was a massive success. And we had a Thanksgiving service at our Needle, and we remembered all the guys that had died. And there was an opportunity for a lot of the white guys, the South African guys, to meet up with their Bushman guys that they'd been working with over the last 10 years or so. I also mentioned that we had hundreds of visitors, hundreds. And we were considered to be like a shop window, if you like, of the SADF in terms of what a good bunch of guys they are. Look at these chaps are doing for the Bushmen, and a lot of what we used to call opinion forming. We used to get leaders from business and from just about every walk of life in South Africa. They used to come up and spend the night or spend a couple of hours, and then we would show them around the base and show them all the good stuff we were doing. And the whole idea was to kind of inform people about what the South African Army was doing, that we weren't just nasty guys that were just doing a lot of nasty stuff. And we had literally, of course, we had thousands of visitors there. Overseas, some that I can't even mention today because of the sensitivity of who they were. But we had a lot of senior generals from our own, and admirals from our own Army and Navy and Air Force that used to come and visit us. General Milan was a particular favorite of ours. He kind of almost adopted us as one of his pet projects, and so much so that one day he arrived there with a very well-known businessman, and he came up to me and he said to me, "This businessman wants to give you some money. He wants to give you 100,000 rand. If he, that's a lot of money in those days." He said, if he gave you 100,000 rand, what would you do with it? And I said, "Well, I need to speak to my RSM and my 2RC. Give me 5 minutes, General, and I'll come back to you." And I said, we need 3 beautiful classrooms for our Bushman school. And the General came back and he said, "Yeah, you've got it. You've got the 100,000 rand." So we got Oldham Young going on his brickmaking, and we built these beautiful classrooms for the Bushman school. And then I got a message to go to Pretoria out of the blue, and I got on the floor. So he went down. I mean, it's unheard of for a commandant to be summoned by the Minister of Defence. Anyway, after a little bit of argy-bargy, I eventually got permission to go down, went to the General's office, and he said to me, "Look, I've got a whole lot of businessmen that want to give a lot of money to you. But in return, you need to do the following for me." And they came up. They also went to Savimbi. They spent the night at Savimbi. But while they were with us, we actually showed them, because they'd given us the money a couple of months before, and we built a beautiful new adult education center for my wife's teachers. And so when they arrived, these guys, we showed them the adult education center, which we built, that was officially opened. And then we went across to Savimbi, and we had a special tie made for them. We had beer mugs made for the guys. And so it was a fantastic opportunity for us to really impact on those businessmen and get them to buy into our project at the Bushmen. But apart from that, General Milan, one day he arrived and he said, "Where's Jackie?" And I said, "No, well, she's not well. She's just had another miscarriage." "Oh," he said, "can I go and see her? Is she at home?" And all the generals used to come and drink coffee with her and with me, and it was like home from home, basically. So I left him. He went and strolled across to see her. He came back and he said, "It's not good. He had the Surgeon General with him as well. And the Surgeon General accompanied one of my doctors. And he said, 'No, we've decided that she has to come back to Pretoria with us.' So he kicked off an admiral of his jet, and to cut a long story short, flew her through to Mapacha for the night, and the next day they flew to Waterkloof. And lo and behold, who was waiting for Jackie at the airport? Mrs. Milan and the Surgeon General's wife. And they drove her to one military hospital. I mean, unheard of, mind-boggling, that a humble commandant's wife could be treated to that extent by a guy who was then the Minister of Defence. I could tell you a whole lot of other stories about him, but suffice to say, he did an amazing amount of work for us. We had General Viljoen also impacted on our project. General Geldness was a great friend of ours. He spent a lot of time traveling to Zimbabwe, and when he used to come and wait for the connection in the helicopter, he used to sit in my office, and often I was not chased out, but he would fall asleep in one of the armchairs in my office, and I would go and find something else to do while he had a couple of hours kept in my office. General Mayram was also a regular visitor because he was also on his way to Savimbi from time to time. And I'll never forget one day we'd rescued a little baby elephant, we'd basically been given a couple of weeks to decide what we were going to do with this little thing, because the sustainability of keeping a baby elephant as a pet just doesn't exist. But the poor little guy they'd wired his leg up with wire. The guys who had killed his mother for the ivory, and the possibility that this guy was going to have a long life were not very good. But anyway, we took it upon ourselves to feed the little chap and look after him, and the doctors cared for him as best they could. But one day, General Mayram was going to meet me at the office, and we went to the pub, and it was just him and I sitting there. But I'd arranged that the youngster who had been given the task of feeding the little elephant with a 2-liter cool drink bottle full of milk, that he would wait on the one side of the I don't know if you've seen a picture. I think there's one included in the presentation. It was open on the sides, so the air would flow freely, and you could also see obviously what was going on. So the guy with the milk bottle was on the one side of the officers' pub, and the general and I was sitting in the other. And the little elephant saw the guy. We'd arranged it. Saw the guy with the milk bottle and ran through the officers' mess. So the general had the fright of his blooming life when suddenly he's sitting having a quiet cup of coffee with me, and this little elephant came charging through the officers' pub. But he was an absolute star and a gentleman and had a hell of a sense of humor. I'll never forget one day when it was just about my time to leave and go to my new job overseas. He said to me, Brian, he said, you must remember one thing, that when you put your arm into a bucket of water, when you take your arm out, the level of the water hasn't really dropped very much. And I don't know where I got it from, but I'm not normally that fast and that witty. But I said to him, yes, General, but in this case, you'll have to understand that my arm will be wet for a long time after I leave here. And he really liked that. And we obviously got to know each other, subsequently continued to interact with each other as my career developed in the Defence Force. I had, on occasion, one day I got a telex from John Moore, who was the military attaché in Taiwan at the time. Let me just fix my light here. To say that the chief of the Republic of China Defence Force was coming to visit me at Amiga. And that was a massive thing, as you can imagine. And it was hush-hush, extremely sensitive, top secret, as you can imagine. But as it happened, a couple of days after I got the telex, there was a professor from America, from Georgetown University, who visited me. And he was also a very hush-hush visitor. And so it was only him and I and a couple of people that had dinner with him in my garden of my house. We had a lovely little private meal there. And he told me that he'd actually been at the embassy, the American embassy in Beijing, for a couple of years. So just sort of off the cuff, I said to him, well, just in case I get some visitors from China or from Taiwan, won't you write down a couple of phrases for me, like welcome to my base and thank you for my gift, and I can't remember what I asked him. Anyway, I had about 5 or 6 phrases. Anyway, the big day arrived, and this Transall with the VIP capsule pulled in at our airport in boiling hot, middle of summer. The door opened, and there I was, and I saluted the general, and I spoke to him in Mandarin. And subsequently, I heard through the pipeline that it just blew the general's mind, because here he was completely out of his element in the middle of the African bush. The door of the airplane opens, and there's this commandant with a funny hat on, saluting him and speaking Mandarin. And I discovered afterwards that it's very untypical of them to actually become kind of like personal about anything. But I remember that night he put his arm around me and he said to me, "How old are you?" And I said, "I'm 32," or whatever it was at the time. And he said, "My son is also 32, so you're also my son." And I didn't realize at the time what an impact that was going to have on my career, because when he got back to Pretoria, he had a farewell dinner with General Malan. And I came up, or the next military attaché appointment in Taiwan came up. And he said to him, no. He said to the general, I want that youngster from Omega. And it was unbeknown to me at the time, but subsequently one morning I got called to our radio room, because we didn't have telephones. We had a radio telephone. And it was General Opperman, who was General Malan's personal staff officer. And he said to me, "Do you know where you're going next year?" And I said, "No, General." He said, "Well, General Malan has decided that you're going to Taiwan." And I mean, it was a huge shock and a surprise. So I said to him, "That's wonderful, General. Do you mind if I speak to Jackie about it first?" He said, "You can speak to Jackie as much as you like, but the General's decided you're going. So you're going." Anyway, I subsequently we had another visit by the chief of the army of Taiwan, General Zhang Zhongling. And he also subsequently, I wouldn't say I became friends with him, because, I mean, you don't become friends with a four-star general. But I met him subsequently in Taiwan, and there was a massive, how can I say, a warmth in the relationship that I had with General Howe. In fact, General Howe, in the week of his birthday, every year that I was there, he would invite the ambassador and I, just the three of us, him and the ambassador and I, we'd have dinner together in one of his favorite restaurants. And I think that's the highest accolade that I could ever have had, that he felt within the bounds of protocol, inviting a humble colonel to have a private dinner with him and the ambassador was really something which I always treasured. The other visitor that we had often was Savimbi. And we had a tent, like a VIP tent at the end of our runway for security reasons. And then the helicopter would fly in and I would meet General Savimbi or Field Marshal Savimbi or whatever he was. I would meet him in the tent and he and I would stand and chat, and I would get him a cool drink or whatever he wanted to drink until his jet arrived, and then he would fly out to Europe or wherever he was going. So I got to know him very well. And I also visited Jumbo on a couple of occasions and a couple of his other bases. And we used to joke about the fact that he used to tell me that he'd earmarked a ranch for me in central Angola. When the war's over and we've killed all the communists, he said, "I will come and find you and I will show you where your ranch is." So I was very sad. I was very sad to hear that he was killed, because apart from the fact that they were our allies, as you could probably learnt about in Hooper and Packer and all those modular, he was a wonderful gentleman. He was an absolute gentleman, and he loved classical music. He had obviously he was a doctor. He had a doctorate, I think, in sociology or in politics or something. And it was an absolute privilege to meet with the chap. So the time came for us to leave, and my 2IC at the time, PD van der Merwe, who I'm going to convince you to get to talk as well, an absolute star, one of the best guys that I ever worked with in the army. I can tell you that quite honestly. The time came for us to leave on the Flossie, and he asked us to please wait until the very end. And then out of the bush came the soldiers, all of those that went away with their red cravats, their medals, their rifles, and they formed two lines. And my wife and I, and I think my daughter Lauren had gone in already with my dad, because my dad had been visiting. So it was just Jackie with Nicola and I walked through this guard of honor on the way to the airport, on the way to the aircraft. I mean, I couldn't have had a better honor than that particular honor.
I do actually have a lot of questions about the Battalion, the Bushman, I always call it a regiment. I don't know why, it's stuck in my head. Bushman, let's call it the Bushman Battalion.
Yeah.
But I think I'm going to hold him back because I have a feeling there will be a lot of questions from the listeners here. And once I've given me all these questions for this, perhaps I can ask you, sir, to come back, or perhaps another officer as well, or all of you, and we can answer the questions. Why not? Because I was looking forward to that. And then, of course, you're invited for your third and fourth session. As long as you wish to talk, I mean, you're welcome here. I think it's important. I think it was Colonel Frans Fourie, the one recce commander, who said to me that if he could only have seen what happened during the Voortrekkers or at the other battles, and he could hear these people talking. He used the actual example of the prayer done by Sarel Silja, I believe, at Bloedrivier, about Battle of Blood River. And then, we can learn from these people. And this, what I see here in front of me, is actually the African way of teaching. We tell stories, and you will remember a story. I've tested this on some people. A PowerPoint presentation is really fantastic, but you don't remember that much.
No.
You do remember a story, and I always say to people, tell me the first story your dad told you. And immediately he remembers. And I said to him, the first time you saw a PowerPoint? Nah, can't remember that one. Of course, it's different. I mean, that's more personal, we do understand. So that's what I see legacy. So it's teaching. And this is what we do. And I thank you for that. And for the rest of you out here, come and speak to me. Don't hesitate. Come and speak to me. It is fascinating for me to hear your story. It's fascinating for thousands, hundreds of thousands of other people as well. Let us keep our legacy alive. Let us not let it die with us. So thank you, sir. And I invite you back, please. Next time we're going to talk on a lighter note. And in a later stage, we're definitely going to get you back to answer questions for us on 3-1 Battalion. It's one of those sad things. It also, for political reasons, I believe, was disbanded. Lots of trouble there, lots of problems, lots of people in need of assistance. A proud unit, it's sad to see it like that. But it's not the end. We can report the history on legacy as well. So until we meet again, God bless.